Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Kearns, and the title of the lecture I'd like to share with you all today is called African American History Etched in My DNA. And just a little bit more about myself before I get started. As John said, I'm a native Washingtonian. So I was born in Washington and grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I actually graduated from elementary school, Grace Episcopal Day School here in Kensington. I'm a graduate of Thomas Wooten High School in Rockville, Maryland. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College, which is a historically black all-male college in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm a graduate of the Harvard Business School. So for graduate school, I got my master's in business administration from Harvard. And so I'm here with my family, my wife Nadine. We've been married for 17 years. And my two sons, Julian and Jacques, and my son is videotaping this for us. And we live in Shepherd Park, Washington, D.C., so it's only about 10 minutes away from here. And I work in the technology field, so I work for a company called Digital Globe. It's a satellite technology company. And so we operate 5 satellites that are 400 miles high in space, orbiting the Earth at 19,000 miles an hour, collecting high-resolution imagery of the Earth. And so if you go onto Google Earth or Google Maps and you look for your house, that's probably our imagery. So that's what I do by day. But I started family history research around 2006. And so before I gave this talk, I actually went on to Ancestry.com and checked when I had first started my account, and it said February 2006. So that's about the time I started researching. And I started researching for a Kearns family reunion that was coming up that summer. And so that's when it started, and so for my passion for genealogy really has just grown from there. And I really enjoy it. So this year, actually, I gave my first lecture at the National Genealogy Society Family History Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina in May. And so, as John said, he attended that talk and was gracious enough to invite me to come and give a talk here. So, really excited. So, thank you. Next slide. So, my goal of this talk today is to share strategies about using DNA testing to help you advance your research goals. And so here are the topics that I'm going to cover today. First, I will share what inspires me to do genealogy research. Then I'll share my strategy and approach as a genealogical hobbyist. Then I'd like to share a bit on African American history etched in my DNA that I've been able to uncover through DNA testing and DNA research. Then I'd like to share 3 family stories that I was able to uncover through using DNA testing combined with research. And then I'd like to end with a dream that I have. Next slide. My inspiration for this talk. My inspiration for this talk and for my interest in genealogy begins with the miniseries Roots. So back in June of 2016, there was a remake of Alex Haley's Roots that aired on the History Channel. How many people were aware of that? How many people saw it? You saw it? I thought it was extremely well done. It was brilliant. But watching the updated version actually had me reflecting on the original version, which I watched as a child. And I didn't realize it back then, but that original version, when I saw it, planted a seed in me, which has now blossomed into a passion, my wife would say obsession, to trace my own family roots as far as I possibly can, and then potentially to trace it back to the continent of Africa. And so that idea that Alex Haley could trace his ancestry back to a noble Mandinka warrior named Kunta Kinte, it was really powerful for me. And so it's really inspired me throughout my life to try to replicate the same for my own family. So that's the inspiration. I'll also say that roots represents the significant challenges as well that descendants of enslaved people in America face trying to trace their ancestry. So within a year of Roots being published as the book, Haley's masterpiece faced significant scrutiny. Historians and genealogists uncovered evidentiary flaws in the family history that Haley detailed in his book. And it really called into question whether Haley's masterpiece should be treated as a work of historical fiction as opposed to historical scholarship. But at any rate, ever since I watched Roots, I've been on this quest to explore and identify my family history and my connection to Africa. And the loftiest aspiration that I will let my mind consider is the potential to trace my ancestry to a named ancestor born on the continent of Africa. So that's my aspiration. Next slide. So getting started as a genealogy hobbyist, my approach as a genealogist really has three fundamental steps. And the first step is to start with family oral history. Talk with your parents, talk with your grandparents, talk with your cousins, talk with family elders, and try to gather as much information on your ancestors as you possibly can. Their names, the years they were born and the years that they died, and the places where they lived their lives. And that information will form the basis of your family tree. And so you should next take that information and build out your family tree. And there are a lot of different ways you can do that. I use a service called Ancestry.com. It's online. And so you plug that in and you start to build your tree. So from there, that's the foundation. That leads you to the next step, which is extending your family tree through traditional genealogical research of records, such as census records, birth records, death records, marriage records, etc. And I'm not here to advertise Ancestry, but one of the good things about using Ancestry when you build your tree in Ancestry is once you plug in your tree, Ancestry will start to share clues, hints, shared ancestry hints they call them, about documents that may be relevant to a particular ancestor. And so you can click on those and see those documents, and that will help you to extend your family tree. So that's step 2. And then the third step is to validate and discover using DNA testing. And DNA traditionally is applied towards validating documented family ancestry. But I've actually found some success discovering ancestry through DNA testing. And so I'll talk more about that here. And here are the other things to note. I know that I've listed this as step 1, step 2, step 3, but the reality is that the approach is not at all linear or straightforward. And so just keep that in mind and enjoy the journey. Next slide. DNA 101. So there are 2 categories of DNA tests that you can take. There's autosomal DNA testing, and then there's haplogroup DNA testing. So let's start with autosomal DNA testing. Autosomal DNA testing examines a person's 23 pairs of chromosomes to analyze your ethnic makeup, say within the past few hundred years, okay? So that's autosomal DNA testing. Then there's haplogroup testing. Now, haplogroup is a formal term that scientists use to essentially describe your ancient ancestral origins or your ancient ancestral clans, such as Anglo-Saxon or Ashkenazi Jew, or in the case of Kunta Kinte, Mandinka. And so haplogroup tests can reveal ancient or more deep ancestral origins, i.e. thousands of years ago, rather than your more recent ancestry. And there are 2 flavors of haplogroup tests that you can take. There's maternal haplogroup testing and paternal haplogroup testing. So let me tackle each of these. First, paternal haplogroup tests. They analyze the DNA markers that a father passes down to his son through the Y chromosome. And so when you pass those markers down to your son through the Y chromosome, they're passed down untouched. And so that allows you to trace back to ancient origins through analyzing those markers. And so that's one type of test. The second is maternal haplogroup test, which analyzes the DNA markers that a mother passes down to her children through what's called mitochondrial DNA. And again, those markers are passed down relatively untouched through mitochondrial DNA. And so that allows you to trace back to more ancient origins. So across both of these types of tests, autosomal testing and haplogroup testing, you get matches back. People who share either your haplogroup or share chromosome segments on your chromosome that you're likely related to. And so this is the main reason why I choose to test with more than one service. I want to be able to source as many matches as possible because they're all clues to help unlock the mysteries of my family tree. So I've tested with Ancestry DNA. How many people have heard of Ancestry DNA? And how many people have tested with Ancestry DNA? I've tested with 23andMe. How many people have heard of and tested with 23andMe? Okay. And then Family Tree DNA, both their Family Finder test as well as the Y-DNA test. How many people have heard of Family Tree DNA? Okay. So Ancestry DNA seems to be the most well-known and most popular. So I've done that, and then I've also uploaded my results to this free service called GEDmatch. How many people have heard of GEDmatch? So GEDmatch attracts users from across all of the different services, so it's another way to source matches. And then I also use all the different analysis tools that these services provide so that I can analyze my results. At the end of the day, the guidance I'd provide is that when you're using DNA testing, be hypothesis driven, but be open to where the DNA takes you, because DNA does not lie. And so you may be told a certain story in the family and you may uncover, and that may be your hypothesis, and then you'll uncover some evidence or clues in your DNA that will be contradictory to that. And so you just have to work through that, but be open to what the DNA is telling you to be able to uncover those stories. Next slide. All right, African American history etched in my DNA. So here's a visual representation of my genome. It's called a chromosome painting, and it came with the results that I received from my 23andMe DNA test. Now, the science section of the New York Times published a wonderful article a little while back titled Tales of African American History Found in DNA. And the article details the findings of a study published in PLOS Genetics conducted by the geneticist Dr. Simon Gravel, who analyzed the DNA of over 3,000 African Americans to assess their genetic diversity. And so here's what the study found. The study found that African Americans, on average, today are 82.1% of African ancestry, 16.7% of European ancestry, and around 1.2% of Native American ancestry. Now, here's how my results compare to that study. According to 23andMe, I am 60.4% of African ancestry, 37.6% of European ancestry, and 2% of Native American and East Asian ancestry. So my profile is a little bit more ethnically diverse than the average African American. So now let's break down this chromosome painting in a bit more detail. So one of the things you'll notice is that my genome includes long, uninterrupted, magenta or pink colored DNA segments, and that offers proof of my deep West African ancestral roots. So all that pink, those are my West African ancestral DNA roots. So those are then mingled with long blue colored DNA segments from Europe. And that offers proof that I descend from the offspring of white men and enslaved women born decades prior to the start of the Civil War. And there's a third thing I want to point out. My chromosome painting includes one long orange DNA segment on chromosome 1, it's right there, which seems to indicate that I descend from at least one predominantly Native American ancestor, likely within the last few hundred years. And then there's a fourth thing that I want to point out to you. My genome also includes stretches of segments that alternate between magenta, blue, and sometimes orange in very short chunks, like here, 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 here. And this is likely indicative of the DNA that I've inherited from free persons of color ancestors who'd been multi-ethnic for many, many generations, dating all the way back to the first Africans and then Europeans to arrive in the 1600s colonial Virginia. And so I'll talk a bit more about that later. Next slide. All right, so you've taken your DNA tests and you have your results. What's next? I would suggest a few things. One, I'd suggest that you test your parents. I'm thankful that both my parents agreed to do DNA tests, and their results have been very helpful for me. It's actually been essential for me, given that both of my parents have deep roots in North Carolina. And so what it's allowed me to do is really sort my results to understand which of my matches are coming from my father and which are coming from my mother. So test your parents. Test other relatives on both sides of your family. Test aunts and uncles. They broaden your ability to source matches. If you're able to test your grandparents, that increases the signal of the matches that you get back, because they're at least 2 generations closer to the common ancestors that you share with many of these matches. Test second, third, and even fourth cousins, because they can help you isolate your matches to a particular family line. And then build on that. Do continue your extensive research of records online, such as census records, marriage records, birth, death records, to pair that and work that with your DNA results to synthesize that. And then leverage social media to connect with family. I invite all my DNA matches to all of the different family pages that I've created on Facebook. And it increases engagement and increases the dialogue and your ability to share family history. And then you leverage those things to continue to build and grow your family tree. Next slide. African American genealogists need to be willing to employ all the strategies that I just shared because of this. It's called a brick wall. And the brick wall is a metaphorical barrier that prevents you from advancing your genealogy research. And so for a 40-something African American genealogist like myself, you might hit a brick wall around, say, your second great-grandparents. Why? Because they were potentially born in slavery. And so African Americans will face many of these types of barriers in trying to advance their family history. But this is the main one due to the lack of available records due to slavery. You know, when genealogists ask me to share my experience as an African American genealogist, you know, and a lot of times it's a white genealogist asking me this, I will ask them to think of their brick wall line and then apply it to their whole family tree. And then that's our experience. And so you have to have creativity and tenacity to really break through those brick walls to unlock your family history. But do not despair. Luckily, there is a record written in our DNA, which we can tap into through testing for you to leverage to advance your family history research efforts. So again, we're going to need to leverage that DNA testing, our records research, social media, all of it, to really advance our family history. Next slide. Next, I will share 3 family stories. And so for each of these stories, here's what I plan to share. 1, I want to share a little bit about my ancestors, so you have the context. Next, I want to share a specific question that I was trying to answer about that ancestor. Third, I want to share the DNA strategy that I used and applied to help me to answer the question that I had about my ancestor. Fourth, I want to share a little bit about what I discovered about my ancestor through that. And then fifth, I want to share how my discovery has enriched my life today. Next slide. My first story. My 3rd great-grandfather, his name was James Henry Johnson, was born enslaved in the 1830s, according to family history, on the Smyre plantation in Lincoln, North Carolina, which is in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. He was my father's 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 mother's father. Got that? This photo is not a photo of him, all right? Let me just clarify that. But it is a photo of some of his grandsons of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And the man on the far left is my uncle, my great-grand-uncle, and his name is Birch Kearns. And I knew him growing up. He lived in Washington, D.C. as well. And he was a really invaluable source of information on our family. Why? Because his grandfather had been born into slavery. And Uncle Birch lived until 2002. So according to Uncle Birch, the father of James Henry Johnson, my 3rd great-grandfather, was a man named Master Smyre. That's all we knew. We didn't know his first name, knew his last name was Smyre, called him Master Smyre. Next slide. So that leads me to the question that I wanted to answer. Was James Henry Johnson the son of Master Smyre? And so here's an 1870 census record for my 3rd great-grandfather, James Henry Johnson. He's living in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. And so you'll notice a couple things. One, the record lists his wife as Margaret. That's likely my 3rd great-grandmother. The record lists his children, and one of his children is named Augusta, age 2. That's my great-great-grandmother. And then it also lists a woman named Martha, age 57, as living with them. And I think this could be his mother, James Henry Johnson's mother, which, if it is, that would make her my 4th great-grandmother. And this is the earliest record that I could find on James Henry Johnson in the 1870 census. I've not been able to find any marriage records for him, nor death records. And as I understand it, death records actually weren't required in North Carolina until 1913. So back to this question I had. Was James Henry Johnson's father Master Smyre? Let's look to the DNA testing. Next slide. So my first step in solving this mystery was testing my father, as I mentioned before. And as I said, I had both my parents tested on Ancestry DNA. So now I know at least which half of my 2,000 plus matches on Ancestry I should look to for additional clues. So I searched my dad's match list by plugging in the last name Smyer. And I was looking for a large number of Smyer descended matches and strong matches. And they were there. And so I also used Ancestry DNA's shared match feature, and I used it to see if my dad's Smyer descended matches also matched each other, and many of them did. So we're starting to build a story here. Next slide. Next, I tested my cousin Fred Kearns on Ancestry DNA. Now, why cousin Fred? It's because we share my great-great-grandmother, Gussie Johnson, who is the daughter of James Henry Johnson, as a common ancestor. So Fred's results now allow me to look for DNA patterns in a more focused manner. And there's a good chance that the matches that Fred shares with me and with Dad are matches that I'm related to through Augusta Johnson. And so I had cousin Fred share his full Ancestry DNA results with me, and this allowed me to search his matches for Smyer descended matches as well. And in particular, Smyer descended matches that he also shared with my father and with me. Next slide. So here's an example of the summary of what I uncovered in my analysis of Fred's results. Here are the top 10 Smyer descended DNA matches that I share with Dad, and I also share with my cousin Fred. And I noticed that our shared matches descend from two Smyer ancestors in particular. The first is a man named Johann Smyer, born in 1723 in Germany. And then I also noticed that they descended from his son, John Smyer, who was born around 1752 in Lincoln, North Carolina. But I also noticed a second pattern across these shared matches. And that was that these matches were also Bost descendants, B-O-S-T. And I noticed that these matches descended from two Bost ancestors in particular. They descended from Wilhelm Bost, born in 1720 in Germany, and they also descended from Wilhelm's son, William Bost, who was born around 1740 in Pennsylvania and then who moved to North Carolina. And they also descended from a third Bost ancestor, William's daughter, Matilda Bost, who was born in 1764 in Lincoln, North Carolina. And guess what else? Turns out that John Smyer and Matilda Bost were married, and they had 9 children. So this really helped me to form a hypothesis that the father of James Henry Johnson was the son of John Smyer and Matilda Bost. So, you guys with me so far? Yeah? All right. So, I went looking for additional clues. So, I'm tuning up my hypothesis, but I want more clues and more evidence. If you go to the next slide. So, I just kept testing. Next, I tested my cousin Isaiah on Ancestry. Why Isaiah? Because we share James Henry Johnson as a common ancestor. And so when I looked at Isaiah's results, I found the same Bost and Smyer patterns in Isaiah's results that I found in mine, that I found in my father's results, and that I found in my cousin Fred's results. And so now I've isolated the Bost and Smyer clues, that connection, to James Henry Johnson. Next slide. Keep testing. Next, I tested my grand aunt, Vida Kearns Ivy, on Ancestry DNA. And so she's my paternal grandfather's younger sister. and she is around 85 years old. And so she's 2 generations closer to James Henry Johnson than I am. And so the signals in her DNA results should be stronger than mine or my father's. And so when I reviewed her results, I observed the same Smyer and Boss descendant patterns in her results, except there were more of them, more Smyer and Boss descended matches, and they were connected to her at a stronger level than they were connected to me or my father or my cousins. Next slide. So here's a summary of her results. It turns out that she generated over 27 strong ancestry DNA matches from the descendants of John Smyer and Matilda Boss. And so I have all the children of John Smyer and Matilda Boss listed here, and then I've summarized their descendants who also match my aunt, Vida Kearns. And I'm sure there are more, but these were the ones that had trees that were attached to the results, and I could easily figure out if they were a Boss or a Smyer descendant. And so with this alone, I feel like I built a good autosomal case that we descend from one of the sons of John Smyer and Matilda Boss. But this wasn't enough. I wanted to go further. I wanted more validation. So if you go to the next slide. So to be even more certain, I did haplogroup testing. Now remember, Y-DNA testing, which is paternal haplogroup testing, analyzes the DNA markers that a father passes down to his son through the Y chromosome. So to successfully use Y-DNA testing to prove that we descend from John Smyer and one of his sons, I needed a couple things. One, I needed to identify a white, direct, paternal descendant of John Smyer who'd taken a Y-DNA test. That's one thing. And then the next thing I needed to do was to identify one of my black cousins who is a direct paternal descendant of James Henry Johnson, who would be willing to test. And I need to be able to compare those test results. And the question is, when the results are in, would they have matching haplogroups? If they do, then this would further validate that my family descends from John Smyer and one of his sons, and that one of his sons was the likely father of James Henry Johnson. You guys with me? All right, good. So I first identified white Smyer descendants who had taken the Y-DNA test. And I found them on a website called Y-Search. And it's a website where you can search for DNA test results that people have taken and posted for public viewing. And I learned that the Smyers, I found a couple of Smyer descendants who had done this Y-DNA test. And I learned that their haplogroup was JM172. So remember that. So check off on step 1. Second step, I had to identify a cousin who was a direct paternal descendant of James Henry Johnson and convince this cousin to test. So I went to our Johnson family Facebook page and I connected with one of my cousins. His name's Greg Johnson. And it turns out that Greg Johnson is a direct paternal descendant of James Henry Johnson. So you've got cousin Greg here. His father was a man named Marion Johnson. His grandfather was a man named Albion Johnson. And his great-grandfather was James Henry Johnson. So it also turns out that Greg Johnson lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So I reached out to him and I proposed that we meet. And he said, sure. And so here we are at the Starbucks in Old Town Alexandria, meeting for the very first time. And so we had a great time catching up, and I walked him through our family tree. So that's my iPad here. I walked him through our family tree. And I just asked him outright at the end of it whether he'd be willing to take a DNA test, and he said, sure. Next slide. So here are his results. His haplogroup came back as JM172. And his top two matches have the last name Smyers and Schmoyer. So these were the two matches that I'd found on Y-Search. And so when I saw these results, I was very excited because I was finally able to validate with a level of certainty the family story that my Uncle Birch had told us, which is that James Henry Johnson descended from a man named Smyer, who we knew as Master Smyer. Next slide. So how has this discovery enriched my life? This is a photo of Susan and Lee Bowman. Lee is my fifth cousin once removed. He's a DNA match to me. And to Dad and cousin Fred and Aunt Vida and cousin Isaiah, and our shared ancestors are John and Matilda Smyer. And Susan Bowman, who's his wife, responded to my introductory email when I reached out and discovered this match. And we ended up establishing a great collaborative research relationship. And it's grown, so they shared a lot of good information on the Voss and the Smyers of Lincoln and Catawba County, North Carolina. And we established this connection through our research. And so now they share updates on their research, their travels, they're retired, their kids, their grandkids with me. And I just appreciate that I have this newfound connection with them. And that connection has enriched my life. So I wanted to share that. So that's story number one. And I'd like to move to story number two. Next slide. So if I were to ask you who were free people of color in America, how would you answer? I'd say if you surveyed, say, 100 Americans with a reasonable grasp of history, of U.S. history, I guess that the majority of them would say that free people of color in America were either free Negroes who lived up north, or maybe they'd be aware of the Creoles, right, in New Orleans. And so those answers are partially correct. By 1804, for example, all northern states had voted to abolish the institution of slavery within their borders. But according to the 1860 census, there were a total of 488,000 free blacks living in the United States. And that's about 10% of the entire black population at that time. Of those, around 226,000 lived in the north, as I mentioned, but there were 261,000 who lived in the south. So prior to the start of the Civil War, there were more free people of color living in the south than living in the north. And there were free communities of color that were established across many states throughout the South, in places like North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina. And in particular in the state of Virginia is where I learned that some of my ancestors lived as free people of color. Next slide. So let's go to the census. According to the 1860 census, in the state of Virginia, there were approximately 490,000 people living enslaved and about 58,000 free people of color. And large concentrations of free colored populations in Virginia lived in metropolitan areas and metropolitan counties, such as Nansemond County, which is now called Suffolk, Virginia. And that's where my mother's family's from. Go to the next slide. So, one of the free people of color living in Virginia was my great-great-great-grandfather, and his name was Exum White. And he was born free around 1830 in Nansemond County, Virginia. He was my mother's father's father's mother's father. And this is a photo of him. And so, as I said, I start with family history first. I got this photo because I took a road trip to Suffolk, Virginia from DC one weekend in October of 2015. And I told all my cousins in Suffolk that I was on the hunt for family photos. Pull out whatever you have, I want to see them. And so during this road trip, my cousin shared this photo with me. And so needless to say, after laying my eyes on it, I didn't even need to drive back to DC. I floated home. If you go to the next slide. And I uncovered some other things from this trip. My cousin also had Exum White's Freedom Papers. Now, Freedom Papers were documents proving the free status of Black Americans. And as you can imagine, people of color lived in constant fear, particularly in the South, lived in constant fear of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's what that's all about, right? And so these papers, these freedom papers, offered legal protection from being sold into slavery. And so I just would like to read what's written in this freedom paper. It says, Nansemond County to wit, I, Peter B. Prentice, clerk of the County Court of Nansemond, do hereby certify that a court held for the said county, the 10th day of October, 1859, Exum White, a free Negro of brown complexion, 29 years of age, 5 feet 10 and a half inches high, who has a scar on the first joint of the middle finger of the right hand, one on the outside of the right thigh, and a burn on the back of the right hand, and who was born free in this county, was ordered to be registered by the clerk anew. And so you can imagine the importance of that description is to prove the veracity of the document. Someone stops you and says, show me your freedom papers, and you show it and there's no photo there, they need to be able to understand, okay, well, this document's described, making a physical description of this person that holds this paper. All right, let's keep going. Next slide. The White brothers of Nansemond County, it gets even better. So word got out to the extended family that I was on this hunt for these family photos. And so a few months later, after my trip, my cousin actually emailed me this photo of Exum White with all of his brothers. And so this photo is probably late 1800s. And so 5 Black men, all born free in the state of Virginia in the 1830s and 1840s. So it's just absolutely extraordinary to me. Next slide. All right, so to my question, who were Exum White's parents? That's my question. And I have a second question, which was, what's their status? Were they also free? Were they born free? So here's an 1850 census record for Exum White. And as you can see right here, he's listed as a 20-year-old laborer living in the household of and working for the wealthiest Nansemond County merchant in Nansemond, Virginia, and his name's James Norfleet. And so this is the earliest record that I could find on Exum White. Unfortunately, the 1840 census for Virginia, where he would have been 10 years old, only lists heads of the household. So you don't get the details of all the people living in the household and their names. I went looking for a marriage record. I couldn't find one. I went looking for a death record. I couldn't find one. So this is what I had. So back to the question, who were Exum's parents? So let's look to DNA testing. Next slide. So I searched my Ancestry DNA matches looking for clues. And I found 2 very high Ancestry DNA matches of interest. Both shared with me the family surname White. And it turns out that they descended from a man named Josiah White. And according to the 1880 census, he was Black, he was from Nansemond County, Virginia, and he was a little younger than my great-great-great-grandfather Exum White. And so these matches also matched my mother, and I'm descended from Exum through my mother. And they also match my cousin Lisa, and she and I share Exum White as a common ancestor. And luckily, Josiah was younger than Exum, which means that he was still living with his parents in 1850 when they listed all household members by name. So let's look at that. Go to the next slide. So it turns out that in 1850, Josiah was living in the household of Meredith and Parma White. These were his parents. And we know that Exum White was, at this time in 1850, 20 years old, living on his own. But at least it left me with this hypothesis that Exum and Josiah were strongly related. Perhaps they were brothers, which, if they were brothers, would mean that Meredith and Parma were Exum White's parents as well. And so, as I continued to research, I was able to come across some Nansemond County tax records that helped me to validate that Meredith and Parma White were indeed Exum White's parents. And so through the clues from DNA testing, coupled with this records research, I was able to identify the parents of Exum as Meredith and Parma White. So this makes Meredith and Parma my fourth great grandparents. And because I was able to find them in the 1830 census, it means that Meredith and Parma lived free as well. And it gets even better if you go to the next slide. So I also found a death index record for Meredith White, and it lists his mother as a woman named Patsy White. And so my fifth great grandmother, Patsy White, was born sometime in the late 1700s. And she shows up right here as the head of a free colored household in the 1820 census for Nansemond County, Virginia. And I'm estimating that she was born enslaved and then freed by Quaker slave owners in Nansemond. And Nansemond, Virginia at that time was known as a Quaker asylum. Now, the Virginia Manumission Law of 1782 allowed for the emancipation of slaves by an owner through will or by deed. But due to the growing fears from the white community that the free colored population of Virginia would grow and overrun the free white population, there was a follow-on amendment that was passed requiring slaves freed after 1806 to leave the state of Virginia within 12 months. And so my guess is that Patsy was manumitted by her Quaker owners after 1782, but prior to 1806. And so I found no records on her and her family prior to 1872. And then her presence in Virginia in 1820 shows that she wasn't forced to leave the state. And her son, my fourth great grandfather, Meredith White, was born around 1800. And he lived his life in Nansemond as well, so I'm guessing he was born free, although he could have been manumitted between 1800 and 1806. Next slide. So back to Exum. So to summarize what I discovered, he was born free, his parents were free, his grandmother was living free between 75 and 100 years prior to the start of the Civil War. Extraordinary. And I also made this extraordinary discovery about Exum White in a lengthy 1871 claim that he filed with the Southern Claims Commission, which was established by Congress after the end of the Civil War. And these SCC claims are available on Ancestry, and I found them to be a great resource. So Exum was a farmer during the time of the Civil War. And so in his claim to the SCC, he talks about having 10 hogs and about 3,000 fence rails stolen from his farm by Union soldiers during the Civil War. And the Union soldiers ate the hogs and they used the fence rails for firewood. And so he was asking the government for $330 in repayment for his hogs, and the price of pork ended up being a point of contention with the commission, And so the government decided to give him $100. He also asked for $60 for his fencing, and they gave the full $60 amount to him. So he received about $160 total out of the $390 that he requested, and that would be $5,000 to $10,000 today. So that was a significant amount of money. And the other treat that I discovered while reading through this claim and through this story was that it featured his signature. And so you see his signature right here. Next slide. So now, here's how this discovery's enriched my life. The story of Exum White and his splendid hogs, as he called them in his claim, is a favorite family story for me and for my two sons. And so it's opened up an interest in history for both of them. And so this is an interest that I now, as a father, can share with them, and it's something that I truly cherish as a dad. And so here we are at the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in September of 2016. They're looking pretty cool, Mark. Next slide and next story. My 4 times great-grandfather, Britton Cumbo, was born free around 1825 in Northampton County, North Carolina. He was I know you're ready for this, my mother's father's mother's mother's father's father. In the earliest document I have acknowledging the existence of my 4 times great-grandfather, Britton Cumbo Jr., comes from North Carolina court records, which you see right here. And it reads, Monday, June 5th, 1837, ordered by the court that Britton Cumbo, a boy of color, around 12 years of age, orphan of Britton Cumbo Sr., be bound in apprenticeship to Jesse Morgan, who entered into bond in the penalty of $200 condition with Henry DeBerry and Kinchin Powell Securities. The Cumbo family is one of the earliest free colored families documented in America. According to Paul Henig's book, Free African Americans, the origins of the Cumbo family in America begin with a man named Emmanuel Cumbo, a Negro who was granted a patent for 50 acres in James City County on the 18th of April, 1667. So Emmanuel Cumbo's descendants lived on from that point as free people of color, and they had offspring with whites and with Native Americans throughout Virginia and coastal North Carolina and the Carolinas and the South throughout the colonial period of America. And so as a result, over successive generations, many Cumbo branches either maintain a black identity like my family, or they passed as white, or they fully embraced a Native American identity. And last weekend I was at the Lumbee Days Festival at the Native American Museum. And so the many Lumbee Indians, and they're in Robeson County, North Carolina, descend from Cumbos. So I was connecting with relatives there. So in addition to the splintering of identities that occurred as the Cumbo family grew, so did variations of the name. It expanded to Cumba, Cumby, Cumbia, Combo, Cumber. And it seems like every week that I research it, I find a new variant to the name. Next slide. So that's a little history on the Cumbo family. So now on to my very specific research question. Who were Britton Cumbo's descendants? So Britton Cumbo was born around 1825. In 1842, he married a woman named Mary Manley. They settled into Northampton County Township, and the township was called Potocacy, and that's where he became a landowner. And Potocacy is an Algonquin phrase meaning parting of the waters. And the Potocacy Creek originates in Northampton County, North Carolina, and it flows east into neighboring Hertford County, where it empties into the Meherrin River. And so through records research, I was able to learn that Britton and Mary Cumbo had 7 children. And these children would grow up and marry into other free-colored Northampton County families. And so most of Britton and Mary Cumbo's children remained in Northampton County. Britton and Mary Cumbo's second child, Junius Matthias Cumbo, also known as Bug Cumbo, was my 3rd great-grandfather. And so the man in the photo is actually Britton and Mary Cumbo's 5th child. His name's Hezekiah Thomas Cumbo. He's known as Tom Cumbo. And it's the only photo that we have of any of Britton and Mary's children. Go to the next slide. So here's the strategy that I used to track down the descendants of Britton and Mary Cumbo. I identified all of my DNA matches across all the different test services that I used who were descendants, recognized descendants of Britton and Mary Cumbo. And they usually show up as between a 4th and a 6th cousin match for me. And then I would reach out to them over email to confirm our connection. And then I would encourage them to join a Cumbo family page that I administer on Facebook. And I also encourage them to add their family members to the page and for them to share family information and to share family photos about their particular branch of the Cumbo family. And so this is the type of information I'm then able to add to my Cumbo family tree on Ancestry to start to expand it. And as I expand my tree out and down, it helps me catch more DNA matches who share Britton and Mary Cumbo as common ancestors. It helps me to identify them. So for example, these matches may not have worked the tree back that far, but because I built my tree out and down, I'm able to connect their trees back to my expansive tree and identify our connection to our shared Cumbo ancestors and pull them into the fold. And so through this process, I built out a 120-page Cumbo family tree on Ancestry. And so just like any other African-American family, they're spread out across the country, and I've been able to connect with hundreds of them. So if you go to the next slide. So here's just a photo of the family tree and examples of some of the family photos that have been shared with me, Cumbo family photos that have been shared with me as I've connected with my DNA matches. You go to the next slide. So, how has this discovery enriched my life? How was my ability to track down the descendants of Britton and Mary Cumbo, how has that enriched my life? So in 2016, I organized a Cumbo family reunion to reunite our family branches, literally separated by hundreds and hundreds of years. And so over 200 family members attended the reunion. We hosted it in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we picked Williamsburg because we know that we have an ancestral relative, her name's Edith Cumbo, who was born in 1735, who lived in Williamsburg. And she's featured as a free woman of color by a reenactor in the park as a key figure in the life of colonial Williamsburg. And so this is our family photo that we took at the family reunion in Williamsburg. So that's how this discovery's enriched my life. If you go to the next slide. So just to summarize, I've been able to utilize DNA testing to reveal 3 types of family stories. One is extensive DNA testing to reveal white slaveholding ancestors, DNA testing and records research to uncover ancestors who were free people of color, and DNA testing and social media to really reconnect family branches and to reunite with family members. And so it's been a rich journey. If you go to the next slide. Here's what I'd like to close you with. In closing, I'd like to leave you with my dream, and it's still out there to be achieved. And my dream remains to trace my ancestry back to a named ancestor born on the continent of Africa. It's estimated by historians that Emmanuel Cumbo, who I told you about, the father of the Cumbo family in America, was born in Angola around 1619. So my current research is focused on extending my Britton-Cumbo family tree back a few more generations through validated documentation. And it's really painstaking research. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. When I was in North Carolina for the Family History Conference, I spent a day in the North Carolina Library looking through court records. I literally spent 9 hours looking through court records for anyone with the name Cumbo, and I found 3 things. Small clues, but you have to go through 9 hours to get those 3 small clues, but it's worth it. And so I'm hoping that identifying Britton-Cumbo's ancestry will take me one step closer towards building a truly validated lineage, connecting back to the Kunta Kinte of my family, a man named Emmanuel Cumbo. And that's all I had to share with you today. Thank you very much.